Thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful yet snowy day. I appreciate you coming out in this weather. So as Pat said, I'm going to talk to you today about STEM in general, but then more specifically robotics and coding for individuals with autism, and STEM for all, really. I say that I'm going to articulate the rationale for including students with ASD in STEM, but what I'd like to do is open up more of a dialogue, since there's a smaller group here, and see if we can all sort of come to some conclusions about what's best for individuals with ASD in STEM, and what are your rationales at the end of this presentation. I'm going to focus on innovative research. So we just had one article in this series that was published, and we have a couple of others that are going to publication. So this is a relatively new area, what I'm about to talk to you about. I want to clarify that robotics and ASD is not necessarily a new area, those two things together. But my research is innovative in the sense that we are teaching coding skills to individuals with ASD and developmental disabilities. When I say that there's been research in this area, what I mean is that there has been research on using robots as the intervention agent, right, as the independent variable to promote social skills. And so there's been a lot of work actually in the past 10 to 12 years around using robots to increase joint attention for individuals with ASD, increasing social skills, communication skills, following directions, things of that nature. But that's more on the independent variable side. What I'm about to talk to you about is using them more as a medium, or even, if you will, part of the dependent variable. So I'm also going to discuss some of the methods that I've used internationally to train content-based learning for all students in the classroom. I'll talk briefly about that, and then I've also included some resources at the end and some hands-on, hopefully fun stuff for us to do. So those of you in the room, I have research information, I have resources, I have how-to videos, I have, that's about it, I guess. So for those of you in the room, is anyone particularly interested in one aspect of what I just said more than the others? Okay, so I will talk about all the things, no problem. So what is inquiry-based science? I want to talk about inquiry-based science first because inquiry-based science is traditionally thought of as a constructivist approach, which is not exactly what we've been using in the field of ASD. We typically use more direct instructional approaches derived from applied behavior analysis, more systematic, explicit instruction. And inquiry-based science has traditionally been thought of as almost the opposite, kind of polar opposite to that. But the idea of it is it's the diverse ways in which scientists see the natural world, and can we make students actually feel like they are scientists and view the world in the ways that scientists actually view the world. So the idea behind it, I think, is really great. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the BC's new curriculum and their emphasis on inquiry-based science as well. The activities in which students develop knowledge and the understanding of scientific ideas is also part of inquiry-based science. What I'm going to show you is how I sort of embed both of those things into the work that I do. So I take a constructivist approach with inquiry-based science, and I use the things that I think are great about it. And then I also have an applied behavior analyst approach to systemizing those things, right? Making them a little bit more structured, making it a little bit more explicit, making sure that, that we're really measuring what we want to measure. So students are naturally curious. When I talk about inquiry, what I talk about is structured inquiry. And what I mean by that is that in this situation, this little kiddo, we could argue that he's engaging in inquiry-based science, right? In what ways would you argue that he might be engaged in inquiry science? What kinds of things might he be doing? What observable, measurable behaviors?
He's exploring.
He's exploring, right? He's checking things out. Anything else?
He's trying to figure out how the mechanism works, like expanding it.
Possibly, right? That's quite possible. We don't know because we can't ask him, right? Is that what you're doing? But it seems like that could be the case, especially if he's trying and retrying and testing and retesting and using different amounts of liquid and different spinners, right? That's a possibility. So what structured inquiry is making sure that we really are measuring we have observable, measurable behaviors, because inquiry is a little bit, what's the word? It's can be a little bit tricky to measure. So in the next clip I'm going to show you, I want you to think about, disregard the fact that this is in a self-contained setting. This was our earlier work. I am not promoting self-contained settings. I promote inclusive settings. But I do want to show you this video because it was one of the first to really explore this idea of teaching science and STEM skills to this population. It's a small group of students. They're in elementary school, and they have a range of disabilities, but primarily autism and developmental disabilities. So I want you to view in this clip are what kinds of things are you seeing? So I'm trying to get you to think about that question posed in the beginning. Why STEM for this population? What's the point? What is the benefit? What do students gain?
So today we're going to see if we can change the land. What changes the land? Let's go over our science rules. Today our science rule says, do listen for your teacher's directions before you start working. Should you just start working without my directions? No, you should wait for the teacher to tell you. Good job. Do you think that land changes? Can we change the land? Yes or no? Do you think you can change the land?
No.
No, okay. Jennifer says no. What do you think, Laura? Do you think you can change the land?
Yes.
Okay, Laura says yes. JD, what do you think?
No.
So we have 2 no's and 1 yes. These are 3 landforms. Look at my landforms. Aren't they cool?
Yeah.
They have soil and trees and maybe like little mountains.
Mm-hmm.
What were our 2 words that we were learning today? Do you remember? Wind and
Water.
wind and water. Good job, JD. I have
Water.
and
Wind.
wind. So let's see if we can change the land. Who wants to go first? Okay, we'll go Jennifer, Laura, and then JD. Let me start with my friend Jennifer. Jennifer, this is going to be like the wind. Let's see. Can you use the wind to change the land? Hold it close. Is it changing? Let's see. JD, do you want to turn to see? Let's see. Oh, look at that. Laura, would you like a turn?
Yeah.
Let's see. Huh. I wonder what happens if we use water.
Yeah.
Yeah? Do my friends? Okay, not too hard, JD. You want to give it a try? Let's see if you put water on it, what happens. The water. Let's see, what do you think? The water is changing the land. Let's do one more.
Yeah.
You want to do one more?
Yeah.
Who wants to do the...
Right there. So what kinds of things did you see students potentially learning? I know it's a short clip and we don't necessarily know, but this lesson is repeated more than once. So just know that. So this is probably the second time that they've had this lesson. Come on in. Hi. So what kinds of things did you see going on? Oh, thank you. Thanks, Pat. With the students potentially learning. They could be STEM skills or other skills too. Experimenting.
There's some vocab in there that she's teaching them.
Wind and water, which can potentially be both STEM skills and what we might term as functional or life skills, right? Anything else?
Prediction.
Prediction. Why is prediction potentially and experimentation potentially important for everyone, but particularly individuals on the spectrum? Does anyone know? Or is it?
It's creating cause and effect.
Right.
Their ability to understand
Right, and so one measurable outcome that we could measure in these studies might be the ability to accurately predict over time, more accurately predict over time with more information. We haven't yet done that in this work, but that might be an interesting empirical question, whether or not having the experience of being able to predict. What are some other things that you maybe didn't see in that video, but you could see as, or before I start that, any social skills that you saw going on in the video?
Yes, I actually noticed that the teacher, before she started teaching, she actually told the kids, what we do and we don't do. So it's like we do listen to teacher before we take action. So it's kind of like a social skill and also like survival skill for the kids.
Yeah, definitely, right? It's both. Yeah, I think that was well said. And there's some turn taking involved. Sorry, was that did I steal your thunder, Richard? I'm sorry. Right, so some turn taking in there. Certainly engagement, right, which is something that we don't always see when we're using direct instruction. Sometimes we lose that in using direct instruction. So so you saw how it was a little bit more structured than perhaps just open inquiry might be, which would be them designing their own experiment, them exploring their own questions and things of that nature, is more open-ended inquiry. Yeah.
The teacher acquired some baseline data with her initial questions.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And we actually have, this study is published, but we weren't looking for the rich data that I wish we had been looking for. So I'm definitely a proponent of mixed methodology after doing some of these studies. So we weren't after those things. We weren't looking for those social interactions. We weren't looking for predictions over time. We were really looking for content. You know, can they learn the content? Yes, they learned the content. But there's so much more interesting questions, I think, around this topic that we can consider. And that's where we'll go next. Okay, so, all right, so maybe I've convinced you that experiments are something that would be beneficial for this population, but coding, robotics, what are some of your thoughts on that for this group of students? Like, yes, go for it, absolutely. With hesitation, what do you mean? What are some of your thoughts? Yeah.
So I have a problem with using robots to teach social skills to kids with autism, because why would you do that?
Right. I totally agree. Right, so why would you have, especially if you're having the robot be the interventionist, right? So some of those prior studies that we talked about in the beginning, that's what they've done. They've basically turned the robot into the teacher, and they've actually done some comparative analysis between teacher-mediated instruction and robot-mediated instruction. And I agree with you. I think that there's a real danger in doing that, especially because the lack of generalization data, the generalization data does not support using that method yet. It might, and they might figure out a way to shape that over time. But so far they haven't done that. So I share your concern in this type of thing, right? So this is where the robot becomes the teacher and is instructing the student in the specific social skills, and the child is speaking only with the robot and not necessarily with their peers and not necessarily with teachers. The teacher doesn't even have to be in the room, right? The robot can do all of the instruction. Let's look at this together. Jump up. The robot can apply discrete trial training, for example, that kind of a thing, right? Now, students do seem to respond to it. Students do seem to prefer it. Students do seem to like the technology. But I completely share your concern. So that's not what I'm talking about today. But I'll get into that in just a second. So, great. What else?
I did wonder, when I first heard about the topic, I did wonder what is the range of abilities that a student might need to do something about coding. I have to say I don't know much about coding.
Right.
Okay, other than that, it strikes me as a kind of an abstract thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering about the range, the proportion of students, individuals with ASD to which this might be applicable, whether it's higher functioning or whether it's students with more intellectual challenges?
I think those are really great questions, and I think and thank you for your candor, because I think that can be one of the issues I face in getting some of this work out, right, is like this kind of idea of, but what's the point, right? Or who are we really talking about when we say children with ASD and developmental disabilities? And so do you mind bringing up that question again at the end of the session and telling me and being candid about your thoughts on that subject? So great concerns, right? We need to be vigilant about this. Anything else?
The kids are being asked to do it, you know, and I know from my kids in class, they
code and they have robots around, so if we don't know how to teach all kids how to engage in that, then they're obviously missing out on a big part of instruction, because it's not just standalone instruction. As an example, my youngest daughter's class is doing landforms, and also they made models of landforms, and then they have the robot that they're programming to go through the obstacle course of
Nice.
the landforms that tie into the other units. So, you know, I think it's important for accessing the curriculum now.
Absolutely, right? And so there's potentially a civil rights issue almost embedded in this, right? If we prevent students, if our fear prevents students from allowing them to explore things that typically developing students do, or our preconceived notions about what is appropriate for this population constrains us, right, then they're potentially missing out on opportunities. That said, I completely understand that there needs to be a focus on communication, especially, you know, in early intervention. So take that a little bit with a grain of salt. So let's get into the studies, and then I'd like to generate a discussion after we talk about the studies, and I'll give you some resources that will hopefully help in talking about this subject. So we've done a series of robotics studies. The first was a descriptive study that I'm quite honestly still trying to figure out how to publish, because it was descriptive and there was an intervention, but we didn't really go into it with the idea of making it a single case experimentally controlled research study, because nothing had been done of this nature. So we wanted to kind of go in saying, well, what kinds of things are we looking for? Let's teach it to a group of students who have autism and their peers, elementary school students, and let's sort of see what happens, what emerges from this study. And so that study set the stage for a series of other experimental studies in which we have conducted, and some studies in which I'm going to be doing here at UBC in the summer. So let me show you the robots that we're working with. There are a number of different types of robots, but I'm going to show you a brief video. These are Ozobots, are the ones that we're using. They're the cheapest that we could find, quite honestly, so they're the most likely to be used in classrooms. They are easily portable. They're really small. I brought some to show, and we can hopefully have some time to play at the end of the session. But you can pass that around. So they're really, really tiny, so they're easy to transport. They are a little fragile. They can be individualized, so they have little helmets and things now that have different football teams or Marvel characters or things of that nature. We didn't do any of that in our studies just because we didn't want that to be a confound. But again, some fodder for future work, I think. We don't want it on a loop. That's a coding term, looping. So what did you see just in that brief clip? This is not my clip. This is an advertisement from Ozobots. I get no funding from them. I get no financial benefit from them at all. But what kinds of differences did you see in just that brief video than the idea of using robots as the social mediator or the actual teacher? or interventionist.
It looks like they were racing with them, like almost like teams. So
Yeah,
having
yeah.
competition.
Competition, potentially, teamwork, joint attention, right? Everyone's engaged in what are the robots doing? The robots are the thing to be manipulated, right? They're not manipulating, they could be also manipulating the behavior, that's an interesting question, but they are the thing, right? They are the object of interest. So what do we mean by coding? This, I think, hopefully gets somewhat at your question, Richard. There's a paper and pencil version, which we can actually play with a little bit later, but these are the markers, and you need paper and a robot. And you can draw tracks like they were drawing in the very beginning on a piece of paper. You do have to have some finesse in how you draw the lines. They can't be too thin, they can't be too thick, things of that nature. But that's typically easily shaped, especially by something as motivating as being able to get the robot to go on the tracks. You can also create individual codes using color combinations. So that's one way that we've done this work. Another way, so that would be something that looks like this. Another way that Ozobots can be used, and this is why I like them specifically, is because once students kind of understand this idea and that these little color codes make the robot do something different, right? So they can make the robot move differently, make the robot make sounds, make the robot movement sounds, lights, they light up in different lights. So once the students find out that, oh, like I can make these different color combinations, then potentially they're ready to move on to a digital version. And the digital version is on it uses Ozoblockly as the programming application, and it has a 1 to 5, they're still working on number 5, I think they finished it now, but 1 to 5 beginner, novice to expert level. And it starts out by using what's called block-based coding. And so level 1, this is actually level 2, but level 1 starts out with little pictures of like a wait symbol and then however many seconds, and you can manually change it on the clock. And so it starts out just with symbols, and then level 2 gets into the symbols and the actual words. Level 3 increases and adds one of the other things that the robot can do. But then it goes all the way up to level 5, and that's when you get into actual Java code, which what we all probably think of as coding, right? With the X's and the minuses and the, lines of code, the lines of code. And so it does get there, but it shapes that behavior over time. And so I really like the idea of this program because I think it can meet the needs of a wide range of learners. So some other reasons to teach coding. Why teach coding specifically? One, these are a bunch of different reasons, but the one that I want to focus on today is that coding is a new type of literacy and will be a large part of future jobs. According to the Information and Communications Technology Council of Canada, there's going to be an estimated shortage of more than 200,000 ICT workers in Canada by the year 2020. What we often do with individuals who have disabilities is we're often late to the game. We're often too late to, sheltered workshops, okay, then let's get job coaches to work in restaurants and things of that nature. And instead, why aren't we capitalizing on this? Why aren't we saying, hey, this is going to be a huge need. What can we do to get our students prepared for that need? Not only that, but Wei and his colleagues, WEI, has conducted a couple of studies in which he's found that individuals on the spectrum, and I don't know what the range is, again, but typically individuals on the spectrum are one of the 3 least likely disability category areas to go into post-secondary settings. However, when they do, individuals with autism spectrum disorder disproportionately go into STEM fields at a higher rate than their peers. So this suggests that there might be some certain proclivity for STEM, or Simon Baron-Cohen has suggested that there might be a systematizing type of a brain, that individuals with autism have. And so I think often we tend to think of individuals with disabilities as having disabilities, right? We think of what can we fix? What can we change? Instead of thinking about what are the differences? What is neurodiversity? And how can we capitalize on some of the potential strengths that individuals with disabilities, including autism spectrum disorder, have? So in addition to that, I definitely want to focus on that because I think it's really important, especially if there is something there with proclivity for STEM. But also it allows individuals to create content, not just be consumers of content. So they really begin to understand that by coding, I can make my own video games, which I'm going to show you guys how to do towards the end of this lecture. And it empowers students and gives them tools to express themselves in really cool ways. You can use storytelling and narration. It crosses all curriculum, which I'll explain a little bit more towards the end as well. So we didn't talk about shared interest, but shared interest is one of the things that I want to look at in my work. Shared interest meaning if we can all gather around something that we all have an interest in, does that promote learning? Does that promote socialization? Does that promote communication? And if so, what are those skills? So this first study was the descriptive study. So these results are not published yet. I'm hoping to figure out a way to publish them. But I did want to share it with you as a backdrop for the other studies quickly. So the purpose was, as I said, just to gather descriptive data about what's happening. This was a what's happening type of a study. Examine the communication and engagement during this high interest activity and explore collaboration and shared learning experiences between children with ASD and their typical peers. And I'm going to apologize to those of you in the room who were at my job talk because some of this is going to be a little repetitious, but. Okay, so these are some of the sample codes in which we're talking. So when we talk about coding, this was the paper marker version. I always want to say paper pencil. Paper marker version. And these are some of the sample codes. What we did in this particular study is as students learned one code, we would give them additional codes. Some students, if they were really savvy, we would give them all of the codes and let them sort of figure it out. Some students figured out that by doing one code, if they have this, for example, if you have the snail dose, which makes the robot go really slowly, if you have the robot move this way in a snail dose, but then go back the other way, you can see that it's the opposite and it goes quickly. And so some of those things we wanted students to sort of find out on their own, right? That's that inquiry base. And so they were finding out that, okay, if I'm explicitly taught snail dose and I have the student go from left to right on snail dose, left to right on snail dose, and then I just say what's going to happen if I put it left to right and then it goes quickly, then those were some of the things that we were hoping to see, and we did. So that was really exciting. So the setting was a summer camp. It was inclusive. It was in Central Texas. There were an equal number of individuals with autism as their peers. It was for 2 weeks, and the first week, the individuals with autism, and there were individuals with autism and their same age peers. And then the second week, it was the same group of individuals with autism and different peers. And so we saw some interesting things happen that second week as students became teachers, right? The students with autism were more knowledgeable in many ways than the newcomers who were their peers. And so we saw some interesting results there. And I think that could generate some future studies. The lesson structure was semi-structured again, using those kind of inquiry-based combined with applied behavior analysis approaches. So there was a mini lesson which just said, okay, if anyone needs help, here's how we're going to ask. Here are communication cards. So kind of harking back to a UDL approach, we didn't do a lot of individualization because we wanted to see if we give these skills and abilities and we teach this to everyone, is it going to be necessary for students with autism to have to learn additional skills? And so we just embedded some of those social skills or direction following, those types of things into the lesson. So help please included things like If you see that your neighbor is struggling, you can ask them if they need help. You can use a communication, if you don't feel comfortable using your words, you can use a communication card to say that you need help, please. So those kinds of things. So we didn't necessarily say, you, kid with autism, this is what you're going to do, but anyone could use it. And it was really interesting to see because some of the peers used the same strategies, right? They use the communication cards. When you don't make it stigmatizing, it becomes useful sometimes. And then we would do explicit instruction and we would use examples and non-examples of how to draw the lines. In this case, they were drawing tracks is what they're called. So we showed them how to draw tracks and how not to draw tracks. And then how to calibrate their robot was another part of this particular mini lesson, and then explore U-turn codes. So once you know how to draw tracks, you can figure out how to make circles and how to make them U-turn and things like that. So some really cool things that we found were that, so this was, first of all, let me say that this was guided practice with paraprofessional support. So there were EIs in the room, there were RBTs in the room, and some BCBAs. And you can see the number of adult supports that were in the room. We did that as more of a preventative measure. It was not necessary. In fact, what we found was that in many cases it became a barrier to have that many people in the room because they overhelped, right? as sometimes they do. So this is an example of the lesson on calibration and preparing the robot for coding. So to calibrate the robot, you're supposed to draw a circle and color in that circle, and then there's a step-by-step task analysis on how to calibrate it. Oh, that just shows you how many adults were in the room, which was not necessary, I don't think. Some other interesting things that we found were that during the independent practice, individuals, or peers rather, would show individuals with ASD spontaneously. If they saw that they were struggling, if they saw that they didn't know how to do it, the peer just jumped in. Now some peers were better at this than others, right? Just that's not human nature. But also individuals with disabilities wanted to seek out help and wanted to help their peers as well, which was a fun finding. Peers organically supported these students with ASD, often unprompted. As you'll see in this example, this is the paraprofessional, is what we called them in the United States, but this was the assistant, and she is showing that if you block the robot, that it blocks the sensors and the robot can't move. And this is the individual with autism. And so she's showing him this, but he's not engaging. So then he attempts, but he's incorrect in his engagement. And then in pops a peer and says, no, let me show you how to do it, right? And then he can figure out, then he figures out how to do it. And so this was modeled, certainly, right, by the paraprofessionals, but we never asked peers, we never trained peers, we never taught them how to do this, other than, as a big group. So observational learning definitely occurred from the target student to the peer. So in this case, let me use my laser pointer here. This little Kai is the one with autism, and this is his peer, and he's already calibrated his robot and is starting to draw a track. So he's calibrated his robot and is like, oh, well, I want to draw that track too. What we found more interesting is that this occurred on the opposite end as well, and especially in that second week when the individuals with autism were a little bit more proficient. So this guy, we were teaching tracks, and this guy spontaneously said, all right, you guys are all using black markers, but what happens if I use a blue marker? What happens if I use a red marker? And so so he drew his tracks in blue and drew his tracks in red, and when he did that, the robot not only followed the track, but it also lit up blue on the blue marker or lit up red on the red marker. And this little girl is thinking, well, what? I want to do that, right? I want to figure out why is this robot lighting up different colors? We also saw that there were connections being made and that the learning space mattered. And this was one of our, I think, a really interesting and yet really simple finding was that I'm going to apply to future studies. But in the beginning, we had just a few, we had basically little stations. So we would have all of the markers in the middle of the desk, but there was enough for everybody. And then each individual person had their own robot, and each individual person had their own pile of paper. So we saw some interactions and we saw some observational learning, but we saw more of that sort of sneak observational learning, right? Like the side eye, like I'm not really checking out what you're doing, but I kind of want to see what you're doing. Versus when we just made everything shared, right? We had a shared space, we had a shared piece of paper. People lost track of whose robots was whose. Nobody really cared. There wasn't ownership in that. They just wanted to see what would happen. This little guy who did draw some tracks incorrectly, no one paid mind to. In fact, they connected theirs to his. And so we saw some really interesting results when we just basically made the space available for everyone. Independent coding also occurred. So once, as I mentioned, once we taught them a few codes, then they started exploring both the peers and individuals with autism. Because this wasn't an experimental study, we don't have data on who did it first or what the cause and effect was there necessarily. But we do have videos showing that both groups did that. So we sought out to find out some facilitators and barriers. Certainly having the same expectations, again using that kind of UDL approach, was really beneficial in this model. High interest materials, inquiry-based instruction, using a bit of inquiry but also using that structured approach. Hands-on materials, inclusive practices, that shared space, a lack of ownership of materials really seemed to make a difference, and peers that were persistent, because they did sometimes have to be, do you need help? Do you need help? Do you need, hey, let me help you, right? So that always helped. And then as opposed to just, okay, I guess you don't, and walk away. So some of the barriers were, of course, social initiations on behalf of students with ASD. We can say from anecdotal evidence that it seemed as though there were more social initiations in that second week than there were in the first week, but again, we can't conclusively say. Motor skills were sometimes a barrier because you saw how tiny the robots are, and so that was sometimes could be a barrier. Intrusive prompting, so these were people who were trained as BCBAs, and that was wonderful, but they were so focused on getting the students to be able to code correctly or do it correctly or explicitly teach that sometimes they didn't take a step back to allow the students to problem solve and to figure that out and to build some resiliency or allow a peer to help, right? So in some ways they were, they could be a barrier. And then materials that promoted isolation, obviously, and untrained peers and paras. So we went into it without, with basically saying, do what you're going to do, let's see what's going to happen. And so there were untrained peers. And so I think that having a bit of training for peers in the future would be helpful. So this was the next of our series of studies. This was, we taught coding, this was using the digital version. So if you remember back to a few slides ago when we talked about the paper marker version versus the digital version, we taught this to high school students with ASD and challenging behaviors. They had, this particular group was in a self-contained school for individuals with disabilities who had challenging behaviors. And so there were 3 students, they were 15 to 17 years old. Autism was their primary diagnosis, and EBD is what we call it. And what do you guys call it EBD here too, right? We. Now I'm a we. Emotional behavioral disorder as an additional diagnosis. One, they were really interesting individuals. So one had selective mutism. One had severe and challenging behavior, aggressive behaviors. And then one had several phobias, including paper. So it was a good thing we were using the digital version. So the setting, as I mentioned, was this self-contained school for students with ABD. So next I'm going to show you a video of what it takes to calibrate a robot. So this is what we mean by coding in the digital version. So that's essentially what we mean by coding, and that was level 2. So in the beginning when I showed you the various levels 1 through 5 for Ozo Blockley, That was level 2. And so the thing that they put at the end is a loop, and so that makes the robot do the same thing over and over and over. The cool thing about the digital version is you don't need the markers or the paper. You control the robot based on what you've programmed the robot to do using this block-based coding. And then you calibrate the robot. You hold the robot on the iPad or the computer for X amount of time until it loads all of the information into the robot, and then you let the robot go. And so it can go on carpet, it can go on tables, it can go wherever you allow it to go. Just don't let it fall because they are a little fragile. And so what we did, that's just calibrating. So what we did is for this group of students, we conducted a study in which we did a multiple probe across 3 participants, single case research design, where the independent variable was explicit instruction using model lead test. We explicitly taught the movement code, but what we wanted to see was, can these students who are 15 to 17 years old, who do have autism, but at various levels and challenging behavior, do we have to teach everything explicitly? So the dependent variables included the explicitly taught movement code that we created, the generalization from the movement code to novel exemplars, and then generativity to novel exemplars. So this was probably the most exciting part, of this research study, was that could students self-select a code, program the code, and then evaluate whether or not the robot did what they wanted them to do. So that was the third thing that we wanted these students to be able to do. So this is just a recap on the movement code, light code, and then how to repeat it using a loop code. So we conducted a minimum of 3 baseline sessions. We measured the 3 dependent variables using a multiple opportunity probe, meaning, I'll show you what that means actually in a video in a bit, but meaning that we allowed them to do each step of the task analysis rather than just stopping if they couldn't do the first step in the task analysis. Does everyone know what I mean when I say task analysis? Okay. I figured, I just want to make sure. And then the intervention was teaching that explicit movement skill using model lead tests. And so we wanted to evaluate, again, acquisition of the explicitly taught code, whether or not students could generalize, and whether or not they could self-select. And the self-select, I just wanted you to know that that included deciding what they wanted the robot to do, creating their own 5-step code, testing out the code, and evaluating whether or not their codes worked. And they could not use codes that had been explicitly taught. They couldn't use the explicitly taught movement code. So the cool things that we found were that the open circles are the explicitly taught movement code. So you can see here that in baseline, for all students, it was less than 10% that they were able to complete on the task analysis using just the explicitly taught movement code. And then we taught it to them, and there was this pretty rapid increase in both level and trend for that particular skill. So that should be closed circles. I'm sorry. That's wrong. That should be closed circles. I changed this. So the explicitly taught code are the closed circles. And then the squares are the generalization code. So that was, were they able to generalize that movement code to a different novel exemplar? So this again is the baseline, nice and low. We did circles, squares, and dots because we could overlap them somewhat easily. It looks better in the manuscript, I promise you, than it does on this. It didn't copy so well. And so the generalization code would be the open squares. So baseline was low, and then there was an immediate change in level and trend here. You can see that it was a little bit more variable than the explicitly taught code, but I think that's somewhat to be expected. And then the open circle is the self-directed code. And so that was the one that included all of those 5 different skills. They had to figure it out, what they wanted to do. They had to program the robot to do 5, and then they had to see whether or not the robot actually did it. And so surprisingly, again, low and really low here for baseline, and then we saw a change in level and trend here for that code for all students. This one was a little bit more variable, and And this was Randall, Kate, and Kevin. Does anyone know where I got those names from? This is how we have fun in research. No one? What TV show? Yes. Yes. So yeah, it was like, oh, what are we going to use? What names are we going to use? This is like the most exciting part of having fun in research. So we did IOA and procedural fidelity for 30% of sessions and calculated 100% IOA and 100% procedural fidelity. So what are some, well, before I go to the discussion, let me ask you all, what would you conclude by these data, and what might be some interesting findings, and then what might be some, let me just start there. I have so many questions, but I'll start there. So what would you conclude from these data and what we did?
This was not hard for them to learn.
Kind of too easy almost, right?
It's almost too easy.
It's almost too easy. Look at that. Like, this is what I said to my graduate student once we got all the data up. I was like, no one's going to believe this. This is too good. This is, we need some mistakes in here.
Tell us a bit more about the 3 kids.
So they did not have an intellectual disability. They had, they were in a very regimented program. PBS was implemented in the setting and we applied anything that they had already had in place, like token economies and checking in and check in, check out. I mean, all the things, right, were already provided as a structure for them. So we did not see literally any challenging behaviors, even in baseline, even when they could have potentially been frustrated, which we were a little nervous about because one student had extremely aggressive behaviors towards others, destruction of property and hitting and kicking and pulling hair and grabbing genitalia. So the challenging behaviors were kind of more of a concern going into this than really having autism, to be quite frank, because they were in the self-contained setting for individuals with challenging behavior. But they didn't show any challenging behavior. And we thought, oh no, in baseline, when they're frustrated and they're not able to do it, or is this going to be a problem? We did allow them to just say, I don't know. They were all verbal. Some had echolalia. One was selectively mute, but actually did communicate a bit during this study, which was kind of an interesting finding. And yeah, anything else? Any other specific?
Could they all read?
They could all read, not at grade level. So they were all at least 2 years behind in grade level. So that begs the question probably, what about students with more significant disabilities? What about students with autism and ID? Or what about younger students? So before I get there, let me just tell you some implications for practice based on this research. It may be that teachers don't need to explain every single thing so explicitly, right? We may have gone, we may be too explicit. But again, you have to consider the population that we're working with. These are not students who have a comorbid intellectual disability. There may be value in allowing students to troubleshoot through some trial and error. We don't have data on the actual trial and error because we combined that as an independent variable. But students did show some, if you will, resiliency in terms of attempting and trying again and attempting and trying again without getting frustrated and without throwing the robots and without having some of the challenging behavior that we were warned that we might see. Students with ASD can engage in self-directed learning in STEM content. You have a question, Richard?
You said you have high interest. How important do you think motivation is for this?
I think it's key. I think that is, so one thing I would like to do in future research is evaluate whether or not going into the study if students do have a high interest in this or not, and how much that matters, right? Because it seems like everyone, in the summer study that we did, everyone wanted to, everyone elected to do it, right? They knew that it was a robotics camp. They elected to be part of the camp, so that suggests some level of interest, right? Or that their parents just wanted to drop them off for a few hours and go shopping. I don't know, one way or the other, maybe both. So I think that that is a huge factor, the degree to which that plays a role in acquisition. We know from other research that obviously, right, like that it plays a huge role. We did do a preference assessment. I took it out because I didn't think anyone would be interested in it. But I do have the data for the preference assessment for this next study for students who were less verbal and did have an intellectual disability, just to see how do you want to learn STEM. And so we gave them the robot, we gave them some worksheets that they were used to seeing, familiar worksheets. We gave them other hands-on science materials, again, that were familiar and not familiar. And I can't remember, we gave them maybe flashcards or something else that they were used to seeing, because we thought, well, high interest versus something you're familiar with and you really know. Oh, and then we gave them little wind-up toys that were kind of like robots, so we tried to get it like close-in non-exemplars. And the majority of them chose the robots before they even started. So I think there is something there. The question is, how do we find people who might not be interested in this, right? That's my question. I mean, everyone has to be interested in it, but maybe not. So I think that would be an interesting empirical question. So the next study that we did, any other questions before I move on to the next study? Yeah, sure.
So based on what you just mentioned, everybody's really interested, and children with disability or with autism actually did really well. So is there any challenging behavior occur during the whole?
Never.
Never?
It was really bizarre. Yeah, it was, again, like really, is it the motivating materials? Is it, the fact that they're motivated by this? We thought for sure in baseline we would see some challenging behaviors, because we were asking them to do at least 3 different things that we knew that they were not able to do. That's what you do in baseline, right? Unfortunately, in experimental research. And so we had to make sure that they didn't know those skills. And they were able to say, I don't know, the individual with selective mutism could push the items away to indicate that she didn't want to take part in it. But other than that, literally there were no robots being thrown, no robots being hurt, and no robots were harmed in the process of any of these studies, so that was good. Or students, for that matter. So, yeah, great question, though. We thought for sure that would, and I have a video at the end, too, of one of the students, actually from this study, but he was at the same school as the others, but he was an elementary school student. And I'll show you him in a minute. So this next study, there were 4 students. 2 were in 3rd grade, 2 were in 4th grade. They all had an ASD diagnosis. 3 were eligible for the alternate assessment based on alternate achievement standards, which in the United States indicates that they have a significant cognitive disability or an IQ typically below 55. Not always, but traditionally, if you're eligible for the AAS, you do have those. They all had vocal verbal ability. Some of them were more, verbal than others. The setting was self-contained classroom for students with moderate and severe disabilities, and it was in a high-need urban school district. This study, we employed a multiple probe across skills single case design so that we could evaluate, we could evaluate more at an individual level. And the independent variable was the same as the last, so explicit instruction using model lead test. The 3 different skills that we evaluated in this study were calibration, drawing tracks, and creating a code, and we did do a generalization measure, but those were our primary dependent variables for this study because we didn't know whether, we were running both of the studies at the same time, the high school study and this study, and so in designing it, we thought we don't want to make it too hard for students. Let's just see if they can do this, and then that'll build on a series of research studies. So the baseline, we did teach vocabulary using constant time delay, so we didn't want that to confound their ability to and not during baseline, before baseline, that should say. So before we even asked them, calibrate your robot, we wanted them to make sure that they knew what calibrate meant, right? Because that's not really fair to say, you know, blah, 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 your robot, and we don't know what blah, blah, blah is. So we made sure that they knew the vocabulary that we were using, and we taught that prior to baseline. And then during baseline, you know, we could ask them to calibrate the robot, draw tracks, and create a code. So the independent variable, again, was using model lead test. So this was calibration. This would be drawing tracks, right? That would be that idea. It was a 5-step task analysis for drawing tracks. And then creating the code would be something like this. And we wanted them to just create one explicitly taught code. I'm supposed to introduce the video. So before I start, this next video will show you a bit of the procedures in terms of teaching calibration. So it will show you the data collection measure that we used. It will show you the one baseline data session from one student, and then it will show you the immediate intervention session immediately.
Calibrate your robot.
Robot.
What's next? Okay.
Okay.
Okay. What's next? Your robot turned white. What's next? My turn. The robot is calibrated. Okay, show me you're ready to work. Good job showing me you're ready to work. Today we're going to practice steps to calibrate our robot. My turn. I'm going to calibrate my robot. First, I find the black circle.
What's this?
Then I move the black circle in front of me.
In front of me.
That's right.
What's this?
Then
It's the second.
I'll press
This
the
is
button
the second.
until it's white. And I put it on the black circle.
Wait.
My robot is calibrated
We
because
did
it turned green. We did it. Okay.
calibrate our robot.
We are. Okay. Now, let's do it together. We're going to calibrate our robots. First, we find the black circle. Find yours. Find your black circle. Good job finding your black circle, Greg. Next, we move it in front of ourselves. Good job moving it in front of you. Next, oh, bless you. Next, we hold the button until it's white, and we put it on the black circle. My robot's calibrated because it turned green.
It's not purple. It's not purple.
It's not purple. You got it.
Okay. It's not purple. Not purple. If it's turned, it's white. No. Oh, okay. We did
Calibrated the robot because it turned green. Okay. Okay, one moment.
Calibrate your robot.
Oh, wait 1 second. Okay, Greg. Calibrate your robot.
Circle.
Good job finding the circle
What's this? It's a circle.
and placing it in front of you.
Turn its way. Okay.
Calibrated your robot. Ready to work looks like this. Good job showing me you're ready to work. Calibrate your robot.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
So in addition to calibrating the robot, what kinds of things did you maybe see in that video that were different in your intervention versus baseline? Or the cold probe. The cold probe is what we do. So we do baseline data. We collect baseline data for 3 or more sessions, and then we do a cold probe. We intervene, so we do the model lead test intervention, and then the following day we begin with a cold probe. So that's what we collect the data on. So we collected data for intervention, but we didn't graph those data. Anything else besides calibration you saw, Richard?
I noticed you allowed children to explore, to experiment, if you wish, in a micro level, how to do that task.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than correcting them immediately, or starting over again, or anything like that. I thought that was kind of interesting.
This turn-taking vocabulary, like some of those other sort of social aspects.
Yeah, and this was a student who also had challenging behavior, not to the degree that the other students did, but what we found somewhat surprising was his willingness to keep trying and not want help, right? He didn't ask for help. He didn't
want help.
He clearly didn't want help. He wanted to do it himself. And I think those of us that work with individuals with autism often see that that skill is not as developed as we would like, right?
Was that deliberate as part of the inquiry construct that you were talking about initially?
Yeah, so we gave them enough time, right? We gave them 5 seconds to initiate the task and up to 10 seconds to start it, which it doesn't take that long, right? And then we asked, do you need help? And then we intervened if they needed to. But yes, absolutely. You can't see it as much in this because it is much more structured than some of the previous work that we've done. But anything else? Did you notice anything else? What about his talking? Did anybody notice?
He really used his language to direct himself to the next step.
Yeah, he was clearly scripted,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's time to calibrate your robot, da 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 da. Like he's walking himself through the steps, right?
it wasn't inappropriate.
No.
It was quite appropriate.
It was quite appropriate.
And in fact, you wonder if somebody had said to him,
Don't talk, if he would have been able to do it.
Right.
Because he really used his, he's self-regulated with the vocalization.
Absolutely. And he also used some wording that we didn't, right? Like C is for circle, and this is a circle, and it's not a square, and things like that. Like that was obviously, we didn't teach him that. So I thought that was kind of cool too, that he was, but it's still relevant, right? Still distinguishing between those two. How are we on time?
yeah, about 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. So here were the data from that student. Oops, just kidding. So this was participant 1. So again, calibration, drawing tracks and codes for the 3 different levels. We can see an immediate change in level and trend for all 3 of the skills. So again, we probably made this a little bit too easy. We didn't have, we unfortunately probably had some ceiling effects. And so that's something that I want to make sure in future studies that we can account for that, right? Or we do the next level, like this is level 1, and then we move to level 2 and level 3 and level 4, and that kind of a thing. But
Nothing wrong with giving success.
right. I mean, the data are great, right? But yeah, like these were the first of the studies, so we really thought, yeah, but let's push the end. Now it's time, right? Now we know, yes, they can code, right? Because we had some of those preconceived notions, like, is this going to be too hard for them? Is this really appropriate? Is this what we should be doing, right? And how. So the next video I'm going to show you is one of the students from the same study, but he was in the self-contained setting of the previous study. So the high school study, but he's in elementary school. And so he is an individual with autism, and he was on the alternate assessment. He, this was, I believe it was after the first intervention probe, but before the second intervention probe. My doc student was intervening with him at this moment, and he came after the session and said, hey, I have something to show you. And so he's telling John Wright, the doctoral student, about this robot. And so John's like, well, can you show me this robot? So he starts filming. Thank goodness he did, because I think this is a really cool video.
I made a round out of a cylinder. It was supposed to be like a circle, but it turned into a cylinder. And here's the tracks.
Those are where the wheels roll?
Uh-huh.
That's incredible. You built your own robot.
And
now what is this? Like right there?
battery.
Battery. And that?
Off.
Oh, the button. Off and on. And are all of these, I bet I know what these things are.
Cameras.
Oh, and are these sensors?
Lights and sensors.
That's incredible.
And there's like hidden sensors right in here.
On the bottom?
Mm-hmm.
That's so cool.
It would make it look a lot better without sensors right behind it, like a car.
And you made this on your own?
Yep, and if I can get one of them off, which is the inside. Yep, I can't get it off from there, but I think I can get it off from behind him since he's not. Actually, I can get it off from the bottom.
So what'd you put the stuff in the middle for so it wouldn't collapse?
It's slime paper, and I put like fake lettering, like so I don't have to write it on my own, and it's created by a laptop, which I made laptop.
Oh, you powered it by a laptop? Can I look in? So you have like codes written on the paper?
Yeah, like 10 divided by certain thing, and
so there's calculations in there.
yeah.
That's incredible.
And
Dude,
there's
high
like
five on that.
pistons on right there. You can see the second sheet. That's what I wanted to show you, but it's cramped in here.
Oh, we can take it apart later if you want
Yeah.
to. All right, that's amazing.
If you just
The student persisted and was like, no, I am going to show you what's in here.
not only that, see there's like pipes, coating, and that's like power source.
Oh, you did it on the inside too. Power sources.
Pistons to make the
Oh, it's like a
wells.
circuit board on the inside.
It,
Uh-oh, we'll get some more tape. Oh, you fixed it. So show me what's this.
if I crumble it, it'll show. I believe this is first picture.
Whoa. So you have calculations in here that the
Yep.
computer's using to control it?
And I will just go ahead and take that document on and show you. They're all different.
Oh, so there's no two codes that are the same?
No.
So each one of these goes with like a different thing that the robot will do?
Yeah, I think I'm tearing him apart.
Oh yeah, don't tear them apart. Here, you want to crumple that and put them
Yeah.
back in? That's pretty amazing, dude.
So this was one example. So when we take a closer look, this is what he did. And he has what the calculations correspond to, the type of movement that it corresponds to. And the other interesting thing that he did here is these are all factors of 5. And so the next one would be all factors of like 7. The next one would be all factors of 2 or whatever. So yeah, I was like, wow, talk about ceiling effects. We definitely need to go further with this kiddo. So I'm going to skip over future directions just because we can get there if you want me to, but because of time, I want you to see some of the resources that I've pulled together. So first I want to say that coding is directly tied to BC's new curriculum, and so this is just a curriculum overview. And then specifically within this strand of applied design skills and technologies curriculum overview, which starts at grade 6 and goes to grade 9, robotics in particular and coding are 2 of those areas in which BC is now focused on. There's some coding resources connected to BC's curriculum specifically that I wanted to share with you. So these are Code BC, and I'll show you, I'll connect you to the video. I'm not sure that we have time for the video, but I wanted you to see the students instead of resources. So, but what I like about this is the resource search can go by grade level, subject area, and it has all subjects. Core competencies, so the core competencies in the BC curriculum are things like social and personal responsibility, communication, things of that nature. And so it connects to the core competencies, the resource type, the technical skills necessary. So I think this comes to your question in the beginning, Richard. Some technical skills are not even necessary for some of these coding applications. The cost, there are many that are free, whether or not a student login is required, whether or not there needs to be any advanced preparation, and then ratings. One I want to share with you that is a little bit old school. It's an oldie but goodie for those of us in the coding community. It's called Scratch. And Scratch uses that same idea of the block-based coding like Ozo Blockley did, but it's to create programs on the computer. And so students, it's free. It was developed by MIT. It teaches kids they claim 8 to 16-year-old to create these blocks of code together and then share all of the projects. So you can go online and share video games that are created with this, share stories, science simulations, birthday cards, interactive stories, you name it, you can create it using this program, which is really pretty cool. So here's a how-to step-by-step if you want. And I can send you just this slide, so it's a little bit blown up because I know it's hard to see on the little slides. But if you go to scratch.mit.edu, there are, you can actually probably Google how-to videos, but this is just step-by-step. And it's I wanted to show you that it's just easy, right? You click on create, you click on the question, you click on step by step, getting started with Scratch and begin, and it walks you through, like literally through the steps. So if you are wanting to teach this or thinking about teaching coding, this is a great way to sort of play with it and see how much you can actually do not knowing anything about coding. And then these are additional resources. So Scratch Ed has additional videos that show you how to make like video games and things like that. Invent with Scratch. Oh wait, that was that one. Scratch Ed is, this is for teachers wanting to teach coding, and it provides resources for that. And then there's also a handbook for parents and teachers that goes through explicitly step-by-step how to do it. Some more free coding resources, there's tons. So they're on the BC curriculum website, that website that supports the BC curriculum. In addition to Scratch, Scratch is like I said, an oldie but goodie, but there's also Blockly, Code Combat, Code.org, Codable, we talked about Scratch, and then Tinker. And these are all for various ages. So like Tinker, it starts at age 4. So that would be perfect for your kiddos, right? Or Code.org starts at a pretty young age. And they all have slightly different ways of teaching it and doing it, but most of them use sort of that block-based coding to start. What Scratch also does that I like about Ozo Blockly is it eventually goes to JavaScript, and you can actually enter in JavaScript. So that's kind of nice to be able to get to the point where we're coding in terms of the way that everyone thinks of what coding is, but it's a lot easier than that. Here's some other robotics resources. So the one I used was Ozobot, the third one down, but there's also Cosmo, I think, has a little video. Yeah, he has a little video. So that's Cosmo. Cosmo costs a little bit more, but he's got a little bit more of a personality. He's kind of sassy. I kind of like his personality. Bbot and Probot are these ones. These are for designed specifically for younger kids, and they use the model. If those of you that are old enough remember the little turtle that we used when we designed computer programs. Yeah, you guys are too young. When we first had computers and we were drawing things on the computer, we had like a little turtle. This is a blown up interactive turtle, essentially. And then BuzzBots are these little guys down here, and then Lego Mindstorms by Lego. But BuzzBots are about $150 for the set of these two. Lego Mindstorms are around the same, are relatively expensive. Ozobots are about $80 you can get, and you can get classroom sets for less than that. So some tips that I just want to leave you with, and then I'll answer any questions that you might have. Have fun while doing it. I would recommend don't let your technophobia or your I don't know if I can do this, interfere with if you're curious about this and want to do it. I knew STEM, but I didn't know anything about coding before we started this. This wasn't something that was in my background. I'm not a coder, right? But in doing this, it's like, oh, this is really easy, and I can teach myself pretty easily and therefore teach others. So, but saying that, ensure that you're familiar with the specific tool, but also don't worry about being the expert, because as you saw in this video, sometimes our kids show us how to do it, right? And we saw that in some of our work was like, no, let me show you how to, X, Y, and Z. Just like my grad students sometimes show me how to do techie things that I appreciate. Have a clear vision for what you want to accomplish and champion in your school to co-teach it. It's all about integrated learning, and so once you go to that site and you can see that all the subject areas that it really does, it's really cross-categorical. Have a growth mindset or a fail-forward approach. So if we can have that mindset of just like she did in the baseline session when she kept trying to turn on the robot and she didn't get frustrated, she just kept trying, and she knew it would. Technology has its pitfalls, right? And we just have to own that and be okay with it. And if we model try again, then hopefully that'll transition to our students. Bring outside experts in, wink, wink, nod, nod. Not that I'm an expert, but you know, if you want to use me, I'm available. Invite guest speakers. Let your learners be creative, and let that be the guide. What do they want to explore? What do they want to see? What do they want to make? Especially with Scratch, there's so many different things that they can do. And then be creative and don't be afraid to fail. Most importantly, have fun. So I'm going to pose this question from the very beginning. Why teach STEM, including coding and robotics, to all students? Back to you.
Because it's motivating.
It's motivating, yes. Super motivating.
It's very fun to do.
It's fun.
Yeah.
It's motivating. It's fun.
Future jobs.
Future jobs. Yes, for sure. Let's get ahead of this, right? Let's be ahead of this for once instead of like 10 years behind. What else?
And even if you don't care about the coding part, there's all the collateral skills that come along with it.
Right.
Right.
So especially in Scratch, if you can design, you know, think of all the options that you could have in Scratch in developing cooperative learning groups, right? You have to have cooperative learning groups. Your group has to create a story. Your group has to create a video game. Your group has to create a science simulation, right? And then we all come back together and we play, and we get to play with it, right? How fun is that? So I think the other piece of this that's really interesting and intriguing for me is this idea that it is fun, it is motivating, but there's ownership in it too, right? There's this idea of autonomy and being able to, I did this, I created something, I made something.
I like the notion that it's so visual, that it's more accessible than I really thought. I mean, my last experience with anything remotely like this was writing commands for SPSS a long time ago.
Right.
And I was really struggling with how that would work here. But, this stuff has really progressed, and I think it is more accessible. One of your students some time ago showed us the results of her research, in which she had some nonverbal students in a classroom. I think it was grade 5-ish, and she was trying to create some social interaction. And so she used voice-activated stuff to play a game, and you couldn't play the game unless you used the same technology that the kid with ASD was using to play that game. And so all of a sudden this became really popular, and we started to develop, at least in the video that your student showed us, joint attention and all kinds of other good things were happening. One of my questions was, did you try to measure any of these external kinds of things in any way through your so far?
I have not, but that's the next step. That's where I'm going with this work. So the social aspect of it and that shared interest is really, and communication and joint attention and mutual enjoyment and all of those, resiliency, grit, right, determination, all of those factors are that's the next sort of phase in my trajectory.
Do you want to talk for 1 minute, because that's what we have, about the summer study, because some of these people might be able to help you recruit.
Oh, sure, yeah. So the summer study, we're going to do I always say we, because I used to have a team of people. Now it's me, myself, and I. Me and some graduate students, actually, will be doing a summer robotics camp. It's going to be an inclusive camp, and it will be for about an hour a day for 3 weeks. And we'll be teaching, we'll definitely be using Ozobots, but to address those ceiling effects and also issues in continuing to stay motivated, we're going to use some other, we're probably going to use Mindstorm and one of the other robots as well, and probably Scratch. So the idea will be individuals with autism, approximately 6 to 10, because we are doing a single case research study and I want to keep it small for now. Hopefully STARE will help me with a group study in the future, so we can do some more students. We can have some more students participate. And then about the same number of students that are typically developing. It's geared for elementary age, so at least first grade. 1st to 4th grade is where I'm trying to, the population that I'm trying to recruit. And we will be teaching calibration and coding and all of those skills, but those will not be the primary dependent measures. Primary dependent measures will be social communication and mutual enjoyment. So we'll be teaching the coding skills, but will there be, with an increase in knowledge and how to do this, will there be some of those social skills developing? So, yeah.
And are you recruiting through Canucks Autism Network?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there will be stuff on the Canucks Autism Network website.
Yes.
About the camp.
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody knows kids who might be interested, send them to the CAN website, and they'll find the information there and can indicate that they will be, that they're interested, because you're gonna start recruitment fairly
Soon.
Fairly soon,
Yeah.
right?
Very soon.
So go to the CAN website, look for the robotics camp,
And it will be at Britannia Community Center. They've already
East Van.
in East Van. They've already committed to having this at their site. So, and it will be Monday through Friday for an hour. We're not sure of the specific time yet. That's what we're trying to work out. I'd like to be able to have parents who work be able to take their children, but that's such a busy time of day that we're not. And Britannia has a day camp right now, so we're not sure if we're just going to attach that on to the day camp, or if that's going to actually be integrated as part of their day camp. So we're working out those logistics, but it will be an hour Monday through Friday for at least 3 weeks, and maybe a fourth week if we can work it out. And then in the fall, we will also be doing a robotics camp. The details of that are yet to come, but that one will be similar. But it will probably only be an hour twice a week, because kids will be in school, and it will be an after school type of program. But if any of you are interested, or think your teachers might be interested in doing this work actually in classrooms, I'm available to chat about potential collaboration. So,
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.